Good evening. It is my distinct honor to introduce tonight Mr. Roger Ferguson, Jr., the former Vice Chairman of the Board of Governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System and the President and CEO of TIAA. After graduating from Harvard in 1973 After graduating from Harvard with a BA magna cum laude in economics in 1973, a JD cum laude in 1979, and a PhD in 1981, Mr. Ferguson worked as an attorney at Davis Polk & Wardwell, and subsequently as a partner at McKinsey & Company. As the sole Fed governor present in Washington after 9/11, Mr. Ferguson was tasked with directing the Fed's initial response to the attacks, actions which many have labeled as the saving grace of the U.S. financial system. Before joining TIAA in 2008, Mr. Ferguson served as the head of financial services for Swiss Re. A patron of both the arts and academia, Mr. Ferguson served on the board of trustees of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, the Institute of Advanced Study, as well as the MoMA, amongst many other institutions. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Roger Ferguson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry. Sit here or stand here? Okay, we'll sit. Okay. Trying to figure out how you want to ask your questions. All right, go ahead.
Can you be a two-way street?
Yep.
So Roger, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to sit down with you and talk a bit about your career and your time at TIAA. And thank you, Chris, for those introductions. So you've had a very illustrious career starting out at Harvard, going to Davis Polk, to McKinsey, to the Fed, and now at TIAA. And I'm curious if you could speak a bit about your tenure at TIAA and your role as CEO.
Sure. So I've been at TIAA since 2008. Some of you may know, some of you may not. We are a company that manages about $980 billion of retirement funds, primarily for people in the not-for-profit sector, including the faculty at Princeton, among other places. Since I've been there, I started in 2008, as I said, just before the financial crisis got going. So my first couple of years were really focused in on keeping the company safe and sound through the financial crisis. That involved basically, reducing expenses and de-risking the portfolio. Starting around 2010, we've been working on a project that we call Vision 2020. It's really a growth diversification strategy. And we've done a number of things, including entering asset management business in a much broader way with 5 or 6 acquisitions. We have been growing out our retail capability. And obviously, we've continued to focus in on being first-rate in managing and overseeing retirement plans. And so, my tenure at TIAA has basically had those two very separate components. The first 2 or 3 years, all around survival, responding to the crisis, and then the period since 2010, all around growth, diversification, and continue to build a strong organization for the next 100 years.
Right. With such a changing economy, with politics and things like that changing so quickly, what is your belief about the global economy in the coming 10, 20 years for millennials, but also for people of all generations?
Well, I think the big questions for the next 10 to 20 years for everybody have to do with 3 things. One is this huge demographic change that's going on around the world. A large number of us baby boomers getting closer and closer to retirement, and then over the next 10, 20 years entering into retirement. Just as this millennial generation, which is the largest in history, particularly here in the US, sort of comes into your own. And so there are some challenges and issues around that big generational shift. One is, what will baby boomers do to make sure their retirements are secure? And in some countries, that will depend very much on social safety nets, such as Social Security, being funded by millennials. So I really want all of you folks to go out and get great jobs so you can pay for my retirement, for example. So that's one big question over the next 10 to 20 years, is that aging baby boomers, the wealth transfer to millennials, how does that undertake itself smoothly? second big question for the next 10 to 20 years is very much around a mystery that's hit the economy for the last 20 years or so, which is a slowing of productivity growth. There was dramatic productivity growth, particularly in the US, from the end of the Second World War till the 80s or 90s. And now we've seen that slow significantly. And the reason that's important, it is by having increased productivity for every hour of work that allows us to create wealth. And so many economists are worried about this mysterious slowing of productivity growth and whether or not that's going to continue for the next 10 to 20 years. If it does, then that will make your ability to be gainfully employed, and in particular to continue to rise into the middle class or upper middle class, that much more challenging. And I think the third big issue for the next 10 to 20 years has to do with these very large global challenges. So climate change, obviously, the current swing towards populism, reducing an interest in globalization, those big macro themes, and obviously sort of geopolitical risks that surprised many of us emerging on 9/11 in the form of terrorism. So how all of those big geopolitical issues play into the primary economic issues, I think, is the third big question for the next 10 to 20 years.
You were the only Federal Reserve governor in Washington, D.C. after 9/11, and you were the CEO at the helm of TIAA in 2008. And I'm curious how you responded to those panic situations and how you were able to keep the ship calm during those times.
Well, you put your finger on the first issue, which is keep the ship calm. And what that means is the leader, and I was in both cases, as you point out, has to himself or herself be very calm. I think it's really important in one of those shock moments, one of those crisis moments, to not be a shock amplifier, but rather to try to be a shock absorber. The second big lesson I learned in both cases is, successful solution really depends on expertise. It's hard to navigate and lead through a crisis moment if you're really an amateur and don't know the levers, the tools to pull. And so at the Fed, fortunately, I'd spent a long time, thinking about monetary policy, obviously, but also bank supervision and how payments work, and check clearing and moving your cash. All those things came into play on that day. And at the Fed, at TIAA, I'd spent a lot of time thinking about markets and risk portfolios, and that was relevant. I think the third important thing, if you find yourself leading through crisis, is around communication. You've got to communicate very, very clearly, very succinctly what you expect people to do. At the Fed, we had a moment where we had to communicate publicly what we were going to do. I drafted a short sentence that became known as the open and operating sentence, which was literally the Fed is open and operating and the discount window is available to make loans or something to that effect, but very, very focused. And I think what you discover during a crisis moment is a time for succinct, focused communication that gives people a sense of the reality, but also a sense of what the solution might be. So it's those three things: being calm, building off or leveraging expertise, and communicating clearly and succinctly.
With regard to recent major political events, I'm curious what your thoughts are with regard to fiscal policy after the election of President-elect Donald Trump.
Well, I think many of you undoubtedly have heard this phrase or have observed that central banks have been very active around the world in lowering interest rates to, in some cases, negative, or in our country, zero or near zero for long periods of time. And many central banks feel they are stretched to capacity. There's not much more they can do. And this is where fiscal policy comes into play. And so, central bankers have been encouraging fiscal authorities to get into the game, if you will, and use some of those tools of fiscal policy. Here in the U.S., President-elect Trump has put forth a platform that includes tax cuts for individuals and for corporations, and potentially large investments in infrastructure. Both of those are sort of classic fiscal stimulus tools. And you've seen, after some market perturbation and volatility, that the markets have responded in ways that are predictable around the possibility of having massive fiscal stimulus. Equity markets, in some cases, not for all, have rallied, have gone up, which is consistent with more rapid growth. And interestingly, importantly, interest rates have also started to rise, which is consistent with an expectation of increased inflation that might accompany the kind of fiscal stimulus that the president-elect has been talking about.
So were these decisions in the election, did that impact the way you led TIAA, considering you have so many billions of dollars under management?
Well, the first thing that we had to think about is in what appeared to be the unlikely event that he would be elected. Remember, almost all of the polls here and even the betting markets in London and other places all seemed to have a point of view that Secretary Clinton was going to be the next president. So one of the things that we had to think about, well, gee, what if that doesn't happen? How should we be set up and prepared for that? Is that going to be a Brexit-type event? Mm-hmm. So that was the first question that we had to contemplate. The second question is, well, in the unlikely event that Donald Trump is elected president, how might that play through markets? First with the volatility, obviously, which we did see, but then trying to figure out, are there likely winners and losers? It's very early to say, frankly, but one of the things that we've been analyzing is his potential programs and what might that mean in terms of different asset classes that might do well or poorly. So what asset classes do well in inflation, for example? How might different industries be affected by the movement away from regulation and some other things? So that's the second thing that one has to think about.
Right. To briefly digress and talk about TIAA in terms of young millennials, some say the nation is in a retirement crisis. Why should millennials care about retirement when it's so far away, it seems like?
Well, for two reasons. One is you are actually paying for other people's retirement, and the form when you all go to work here in the U.S. or I think in other countries too. Most countries have sort of a pay-as-you-go, Social Security type system. And so millennials who are in the U.S. going to be paying a portion of your salary to support Social Security should be very interested in, do we need Social Security reform? Where is your money going to support, let's say, aging baby boomers? The second reason is that's here and now. You're paying for someone else's retirement, whether you know it or like it. And I certainly have now told you to know it. I don't know if I can make you like it, but you know it. The second thing, obviously, is you're all going to retire someday. I know it's hard to imagine because when you're a millennial, in your early 20s, you will have a very, very long lifespan, but you'll not spend the next 80 years working. There will be a point in which you will retire. And one of the most important things to learn about your retirement is that you're probably going to be more responsible for your retirement than I am for mine, for a variety of reasons having to do with Social Security and other things. And then the other thing you should know is if you're going to be responsible for your retirement, the sooner you start saving, the better, because you will get this magical thing called compounding, which allows your money to grow quite rapidly. But the sooner you do it, the better off you are. And so since retirement is inevitable, you're going to be more responsible for your retirement than other generations. It behooves you to start to think now about a relatively simple approach towards retirement savings.
Have you found that transitioning from the Federal Reserve to your work at TIAA, there's been crossover, and also with your work at Davis Polk and becoming a lawyer? Oh, sure.
I'm really lucky because my career has been very varied. Lawyer, consultant, Federal Reserve policymaker, now CEO of a big investment-oriented organization. But all of it has been actually quite intertwined. And so when I was a lawyer, one of the things I was focused on was public offering work and IPOs, that kind of thing, all of which had to do with how securities are often priced, for example. So my first few years were very focused in markets in that way. Then at McKinsey, I was a consultant primarily to financial services firms, and so thinking about strategy in financial services and how you succeed in this industry was very important. Obviously, at the Fed, the interest was much more around growth, but also how markets function, monetary policy, interest rates. All of that, particularly monetary policy, interest rates, and markets tie into what I'm doing now. So I'm very, very fortunate in that, going back to my economics education, which you heard about in the nice introduction, and going forward, it's all really sort of played in nicely into building my own human capital.
I think there are a lot of students here who might not necessarily know where their career trajectory might land them. What words of advice would you give them in choosing a career path?
Well, actually, I'd say two things. One is don't worry if you don't know where your trajectory is going to be. As you might have heard in my own story, I always was in love with economics. That was sort of this North Star, but ping-ponging back from being a lawyer to a consultant to a government policymaker, now to the private sector. I describe my career, and most careers, yours likely, will be what I describe as a climbing wall. It's not a career ladder where you start at the bottom rung and you just go vertically straight up to the CEO suite. You'll be moving back and forth. And so I would say don't be too anxious about it, frankly, because that's the way it's going to work. I've kept most of my jobs no more than 9 years. I'm now in year 9 at TIAA. I'm not planning to leave anytime soon, but nevertheless, my career was one where 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years I moved from place to place. That will be true for most of you. So don't worry if you don't know what you want to do. Figure out what your passions are. It's a cliche, but figure out what your passions are and study those and use that as the jumping off point. The second point I'd make is, particularly if you don't know what you want to do, or if you're going to have one of those careers that looks like mine, which is back and forth across 2 or 3 different areas or 2 or 3 different sectors, the most important thing to do is what you're doing now, which is to spend a lot of time doing what the economists are called building your own human capital, i.e. learning as much as you can. So when I think about my career, it's really based on all the years I spent in school that set me up to do a variety of things that came later. And so I really would encourage all the folks in this room who are obviously gifted in great institutions of higher ed to study as much as you can for as long as you possibly can. In my case, I didn't get my first job till I was 30, which was inconceivable these days.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad I took the time up front to study, because that's what allowed me to do all the things I'm doing now. So my second piece of advice is stay in school as long as you can, build your own human capital, and don't worry so much about that career, because your career path will be back and forth and checkered, and that's totally fine. So those are my 2 big lessons.
During your time in academia, and also when you got your first job at the age of 30, did you find certain individuals to be mentors for you? And do you still refer to them for questions even now?
I don't refer to most of my mentors now for questions, but I've had a number of different types of mentors. So I've had mentors that didn't know they were being my mentor. So you might call them role models. So one of them was a person that most of you have not heard of named Andrew Bremer. He was the first African-American governor of the Federal Reserve, being appointed by Lyndon Johnson in 1966-67. And that got me really interested in this business. And I studied his career a bit and learned that he had gone on to Pennsylvania and gotten a PhD in economics. So I was one kind of mentor. Then I've had a number of great professors in college at Harvard. I hope you have wherever you're going to school as well. And they were really helpful to me. One in particular, a person you would not have heard of, named Richard Caves, because he really believed in me. So it was a type of mentorship that was sort of a challenging, you can do better, you can do this kind of support, but not in a soft, fuzzy way, but in a really demanding way. And he directly and indirectly convinced me that I actually could get that advanced degree in economics. And then I had a mentor at McKinsey & Company, and he was a mentor, a guy named Jim Goodrich, again, a name you would not have heard. He was a phenomenal mentor because he was a senior partner at McKinsey. He was whip smart, but he was really kind. And not everyone who gets to be a partner at a place like McKinsey or at a great law firm has that sort of described as mild-mannered demeanor that really validates that you don't have to be an aggressive alpha male to be sort of successful in the world. And I sort of modeled my demeanor after him, because I believe if you're going to be a great leader, you've got to be really sort of empathetic. And he was one of the most empathetic leaders I've ever run into. So 3 different people, 3 different styles of mentoring. but each one really quite valuable at its moment.
Right. One more question, then we'll open it up to the audience for more questions. The theme of this conference is the rise of the millennial generation, and specifically Day 2 is focused on challenges that millennials might face. Whether political or social or economic, what's the greatest challenge you would say faces millennials down the road?
The greatest. I could list 3, but I'm not sure I can do the greatest. So let me do a couple of them, okay?
Fair.
One is something that's actually recently emerged in this election, and I think you're going to deal with it in a way that I don't think my generation really did, which is the intersection of technology and information with, frankly, the lack of what I would call as curatorial capabilities. So I was unaware of this till recently, but I think folks who spend as much time on social media as millennials do are being inundated perhaps every day with information that's not quite accurate, that's not quite true, that it may be out and out false. This is a highly unusual challenge. So, for better or for worse, when I was your age, there were a few papers of record, there were a few TV stations that were looked at, and there's a general sense that there is a way to sort of sort out truth from falsity. I think there's a big challenge for millennials. You're inundated by all this information, and now you have to decide what's true, what's not true, what do you want to hold on to, and you have to do that in a way that I hope, given what's going on in the world, is what I describe as sort of open, curious, et cetera. So, all this information allows folks to cocoon themselves in little clusters, as we've seen. And that, I think, is not, that's a uniquely big challenge for millennials that no other generation is, to the best of my knowledge, has dealt with. I mentioned another one, obviously, which is, all these issues around productivity and how the economy works. You're gonna have to sort that out, frankly. And then obviously, these very, very large macro issues or geopolitical issues that we've talked about. So 2 or 3, but I think the first one about sort of this overlay of readily available information that no one has actually checked is, I think, a uniquely difficult challenge for millennials, because it's going to be up to you to figure out what truth is and not be, boxed by your view of the world, but really try to understand truth. And that's a pretty big sort of intellectual challenge for almost any generation.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, we have mic runners in the back there. Any questions from the audience?
Oh, there are a few. Oh, there's some hands.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to come out and speak today.
Sure.
I think obviously we see people with careers, their entire career in economics or law as a consultant. How did you know that you wanted to move on when you decided to move on? And looking back, was there anything you would have done differently?
So I stayed at my law firm for just 2.5 years, and it was pretty clear to me, frankly, early on. I joke with my wife that after about 2.5 months that I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. And so, and that was a clear sense that the work itself, while it is incredibly important, and it's important that someone do it, it didn't feel that it was important that I do it. Now, I'm pretty cautious because I met my wife at my law firm on the first day, and so by definition, going to this law firm was the best thing I ever did in a personal sense, but it really, so that was one that was just so obvious. I mean, there was just, I had very little, well, I had a huge amount of respect for the lawyers at my law firm at Davis Polk, which is where I worked, and still do. I think they were, the best in the country. It just didn't grab me, if you know what I mean. When it was time to move on from McKinsey, that was actually not something that would have occurred except for the fact that I got the opportunity to go to work at the Fed. So that was one where an outside event intervened. And then finally, I've discovered, back to this point about, a career that seems to run for 9 or 10 years. At the Fed, I came to the conclusion that, I had done all I could do. I loved the job, but one had to be really careful about getting addicted to, a job that has lots of power, which the Fed does. And I actually thought it would be a good time for someone else to come in and have some new ideas to take us to the next place. So that third case was one of sort of, I would describe as honest self-reflection, that maybe, I had done all I could do and somebody else should sit in that seat. And I particularly did not want to become addicted to being a Fed governor and have that be the only thing I'd ever done in life. So part of it also had to do with age. You know, I left when I was mid-50s, and I wanted to have another, big opportunity ahead of me, which was, sort of what happened. So 3 different stories, and any one of those could be sort of the reason why you leave a job. But at the end of the day, I think you'll always know, because if you don't think you have brand new ideas or you aren't equally enthused every day, and if it's feeling sort of old hat or that you're sort of doing it by rote, then it's really time, I think, to move on. Because you're too young, you're too smart, and you always should be looking for that next challenge where you're going to learn and contribute and be really enthused and jazzed up by what you're doing. Is that helpful? Does that make sense? Good, okay. Any other questions? I see a few hands. By the way, I should warn you, I've got a quiz that I'm going to give you, so it's a pop quiz, but I will not ask you to grade it or be graded by me or do self-grading. Yes, ma'am.
So you seem to challenge the status quo. You mentioned we should stay in school as long as possible, and often we're told like somewhat the opposite, that get experience because companies want experience and things like that. So I'm just wondering, like, how are you able to, stay in school and maybe get your first job at 30 and still convince employers that indeed you're marketable? How are you able to prove yourself, and how can people who are thinking of doing something similar be able to, prove that they're more marketable than other people who've got tons of experience?
No, so look, that's a very, very fair question and a great challenge. So one of the things you have to understand is I always had a summer job, okay? So there were opportunities for me to prove myself in the real world even though I was, going back to school. So I would not say the two things are inconsistent. Find a job that you can do either during the summer or during the school year to show that kind of value. But the second thing is, remember what I did was very practical, or could be changed into something practical. A law degree, obviously quite practical. A PhD in economics convinces people that you have a certain set of skills. So the second answer I always give is if you're going to stay in school, figure out what skills you're learning that might be transferable. So getting a PhD in economics by definition shows that you're sort of analytical, you know something about markets. Not if you're doing the most abstract, purely mathematical version of economics, but doing what I was doing. And so if you're going to be in school, you have to think about what is this telling the world about what I know how to do. In economics, it's called signaling. So there's a signal that you're sending off. And the third thing is you also want to learn and practice some softer kinds of skills while you're in school. So public speaking, teamwork, that kind of thing. So you can demonstrate that as well, because going to work is not all about sitting at your cubicle doing single person analysis. A lot of it is teamwork. And then ultimately it's all about communication as well. So even if you choose the path I did of staying in school to build human capital, make sure you're thinking about it in a way that allows you to occasionally get back into the real world through a summer job and can talk about what you're learning in a broader, more generalizable set of skills, not just what your narrow degree may have taught you. Does that make some sense? Okay? Okay, good. Hope there are a few more.
So as an economist, having worked for the Fed, would you say that our monetary policy is due to a reform in the coming 10 or 20 years?
So there are 2 or 3 changes I think that are underway in the world of monetary policy. And it's not just the US, but broadly. Because central banks around the world have been using their balance sheet to drive interest rates down, and to some degree that hasn't had the desired impact. The US is better off than Europe, and Japan is still struggling to try to get out of its slow growth and mild deflation. I think there will be a fair amount of rethinking of what exactly is the right tool set to use. All of these central banks have gone into a place that is of deep experimentation, and I don't know in hindsight how happy they're going to be with having gone to zero interest rates, for example. And so I think there'll be some rethinking about that, and that I think will be a good thing. I'm not sure what the rethinking is going to be, but I think it'll be a good thing once you do experimentation to try to learn from the experiment. Something that I am more worried about, frankly, is the independence of central banks is always under threat. And if it turns out in hindsight that this experiment was not well thought through, there's a real political risk, called political economy risk, that the independence of central banks might be under threat around the world. I think that would be a real problem. And so I'm all in favor of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years looking back on this period and saying, gee, how do those tools work? That is how one makes intellectual progress. I'm a little anxious that the politicization of central banks might start to pick up because growth around the world has been relatively slow, even as they've done these extraordinary things. So I can see some positives and some things that I look out for as a real potential risk in the world of central banking in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So, hand here in the middle.
Hi, thank you once again for sharing great insights. Based on your experience, I see that generally a lot of fields are kind of dying or we can project it. So based on your consulting experience, where do you think the future of consulting is going, and then the future of practice in law?
So let me start the future of practice in law. I think law practice is going to be highly, I'm going to use the word stratified, between the very cutting edge kind of legal practice that the largest companies and governments and individuals want, that's sort of very, very sophisticated and is really deeply into problem solving. And then you'll have a more basic rudimentary kind of law that can be done, offshored, maybe even done with AI. We've already started to see that, at least here in the US. I can't speak to other countries, but here in the US, you have a small number of law firms that are really on the cutting edge that are doing incredibly well, and then you have a bunch that are sort of scrapping for the remnants of good work. I think consulting is headed in 3 or 4 different directions, all of which I think are visible. One is absolute globalization for the big brand names. McKinsey is obviously one of them. And what I've discovered while observing McKinsey is they've gone from pure business consulting to now having a very big public sector practice. They have a very big not-for-profit sector. Everybody wants that sort of McKinsey's one, BCG, Bain, et cetera, sort of problem solving in whatever the sector may be. So that's actually pretty interesting, because when I was at McKinsey, it was, we had no public sector clients. We didn't do anything with the not-for-profit sector. It was all sort of major Fortune 100 companies. And it's actually, I think, much more exciting, particularly for young people who could go, gee, I want to do consulting, but I want to help solve a water problem in an African country or something of that sort. So I think that's pretty exciting. Obviously, there's going to be a dramatic increase in the use of technology in consulting. That's sort of foregone conclusion. And I think the other thing that's really exciting about consulting is the investment that they continue to make in the people who work there in order to be a really good consultant. It's one of the few places I know where you've constantly got to remake yourself. This investment in human capital is an important part of being a really successful consultant. And so I think both professions might change, and depending on who you are and what excites you, either could be a great profession. But in law, I'd be cautious if you aren't going to be at one of those sort of major, really successful global law firms. I've observed that there's a tiering that's going on, at least in the U.S., that's making that profession less interesting. Now, what's happening in the U.S., by the way, is the number of students going to law school has started to shrink. And so the market actually is working. Supply and demand actually seems to be working, at least here in the U.S. Folks are realizing that there might not be as many sort of exciting top-end law jobs, and that is, I think, allowing the market to correct itself a little bit. Okay? Does that seem reasonable? We've got many more questions here. We've got a couple more up front.
Hi, thank you for joining us. So one of the themes of this conference has been the rise of the millennial generation and their interest in making a social impact through business. And I worked at the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board last summer, and one of the main themes was the ability to make long-term investments. Right. And I was wondering if you thought that your experience at TIAA has allowed you to invest more in sustainability in ways that other companies have not been able to invest because of this long-term horizon.
Well, we absolutely believe it has, actually. So my company, TIAA, is one of the first companies to have socially screened accounts. We have in the US one of the largest socially screened accounts, and that is because we can take this very, very long-term perspective. We also are one of the first to engage in corporate governance and thinking about being a long-term investor and trying to drive towards better strategies, not in a public way, but in sort of private diplomacy. That's very much the ability, the luxury that we have as a long-term investor. Because short-term investors are worried about earnings per share growth every quarter. We are thinking not about quarter to quarter, though that's important to us. It's really, does the strategy make sense? And so there are at least those two ways in which we can and have taken advantage of being a long-term investor. The third is the way our portfolio is diversified. And so we are one of the largest investors in agriculture, in timber, in real estate, which we started many, many years ago, the real estate in particular. And that's all consistent with a very, very long-term perspective because some of those asset classes only pay off over a long period of time. So those are 2 or 3 different ways in which the benefit that we have, similar to the Canadian pension of being a long-term investor, is actually played through in what we do and the way that we do it. So another question back here. Yes, sir. Oh, the 2 folks. Why don't you go ahead? You've got it, and then there's a gentleman
okay.
up front.
So I was just wondering, what aspects of your role as Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve did you enjoy the most? And do you feel like after taking up that role that maybe perhaps that helped you to transition really well into being the CEO of TIAA?
All right, so
TIAA. Sorry.
TIAA, yeah. Look, I enjoyed every element of being the Vice Chair of the Fed. The most important, obviously, was being a permanent member of the Monetary Policy Committee called the FOMC. And, that's the reason that people join the Fed, and to always be a voting member was very, very important and helpful to me. And I also had a moment, several moments when I was one-on-one with Chairman Greenspan trying to sort out what monetary policy would be, and that was really superb. The second thing I liked that was unique to the job was being the international representative for the Fed. I love traveling, learning about different cultures. So I was responsible when I first joined the board for our interactions with the Asian central banks. And this was after the 1998 Asian crisis. So I was in China for 4 times in the first year and a half. I was there, Thailand, Malaysia, et cetera. And then I represented us in Europe and other places. So that was a second part of what I really liked about that job that was unique from what others were doing. And then the third was one of the things that I got to do that was very helpful, at least to me, was I was given the role of thinking about how the Fed communicates. And they're still working on it, but nevertheless being sort of at ground zero as the Fed was thinking about becoming more transparent, trying to talk more about the future, giving future guidance, and trying to balance that was pretty exciting, I must say. And that's sort of cerebral, sort of nerdy, if I can use that word. But nevertheless, those are some of the things I liked best. In all honesty, I think the thing that I got most out of being the Vice Chair of the Fed that allowed me to transition to my current job was frankly being sort of a leader of this really large, big, complex global organization. Alan Greenspan, who was the chair when I was there, was almost exclusively focused in on all the important monetary policy decisions, which was great. That freed me up or allowed me to do a number of other things that were very much in terms of running the organization and making sure it came together nicely, which was very similar to being the CEO of this company. And so although I had never been a CEO formally, I'd actually been an important part of running a large organization with a global footprint that has as much complexity as any others, and that has played into what I'm doing here. Okay. I know we had a question up front here.
Thank you, sir, for coming to here. What I would like to ask is first is the phenomenon of the job hopping, especially for the millennial generation. Like we would probably only stay for 2 or 3 years in a job and then we will move on into the next company. How do you think about this phenomenon? Is it that good, or maybe we should change this behavior? Like how do you think about that? And the second one is more this is like the classic question that I always ask to the people in the executive board. I was wondering what makes you, like excited every single day when you're waking up and then, like you have to work, because I think that, I mean like in certain point you will feel like, like this job is maybe boring, or like you already know everything. So what makes you, like makes this job interesting to you? Thank
Okay,
you.
so let me start with the second question first. So my company is unique in that we have a mission. We're not a publicly traded company. Our job is to make retirement safe and secure, and financial well-being safe and secure for millions of folks, primarily here in the U.S. I find that really exciting. I really like the people that we work for. They are, professors and groundskeepers and janitors and librarians across, and hospital workers and doctors. I think it's really important. It gives me a huge amount of sort of gratification to think that I'm doing something for folks that are helping others. The other thing I love about my job, it's sort of different every day. People describe what exactly is your job. Well, this is part of my job. I'm getting to talk to hundreds of the next generation of world leaders, hopefully sharing something that's useful to you. Early today, I spent some time interacting with the Federal Reserve as a regulator for my company. Before that, I spent some time, putting together a tape video that's going to be used to communicate to some other people. So literally, one of the great things about my job is it changes almost, 2 to 3 times a day in terms of exactly what I'm doing, and that's really exciting. We just talked about the election and having to think through how that might have a big impact on our $950 billion portfolio. So, at this stage, I'm still as excited as I was day one, and that's in large part because the job itself keeps evolving, rotating, moving forward, through time, if you will. On the job hopping, I do think while you'll all move around, and I've moved around more than most folks in my generation, 2 to 3 years strikes me as just a little short, frankly. You can't possibly know a large and complex organization. I would be surprised in most cases if you learned everything that you could in 2 to 3 years. You'll figure out what the right time frame is, but I would encourage you to think longer than 2 or 3 years. As an employer, it's really pretty frustrating to have really talented, bright young people come in and go after 2 or 3 years because they really haven't had a chance to have impact and they don't know what they've missed. And so I would encourage people to think, at least 5, 6, 7 year time frames, if at all possible. I mean, that's one person's view. It's worked pretty much for me, and it might work for you as well.
We'll take a couple more questions. There's one right here.
Here's one. Okay.
Thank you very much for coming to speak here. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts and opinions on the changing field of economics, especially in academia, with the rise and the advent of looking at behavioral economics as a legitimate field, and also with unprecedented case studies like the 2008 financial crisis that are rocking really integral economic theories that were being taught in class, and also being told on the side that this might not actually be true, guys, anymore.
Right.
So, yeah, what are your thoughts and opinions on that kind of dynamicism in the field of economics?
I totally love it, right? So economics is a social science. It's not a natural science. It is about the way individuals interact or institutions interact in the economic sphere, making money, making things, making goods, et cetera. So I think it's really important that it not be sort of tied to the past, because the truths that we look for in economics are not immutable. We learn more and more. It's unlike physics, where there are rules of physics and they sort of they unfold and they don't change. The understanding of economics changes quite a bit. I think behavioral economics is a phenomenal advance to understand what it is that actually incents people, that motivates them, what those little nudges are that get people to behave in good ways that are better for them. I think it's absolutely superb. That's at the essence of a social science, it seems to me. And finally, learning from past mistakes, that's what good academia is all about. Again, what we do in economics is quite different from chemistry. And I think it's important to keep learning, these so-called rules and recognize, or these laws, and recognize that they change over time. So I'm completely open to it. I never wanted to be an academic economist, but the fact that what's being taught in class now is so dramatically different from what was taught when I was going to school 30, 40 years ago, I think is just a great sign of a healthy social science. I am particularly excited about this year's Nobel Prize for Oliver Hart, for example. The kind of work that he does on contracting was actually something that I did years ago for my thesis. I haven't called him up to tell him that he got my Nobel Prize, but nevertheless, I do. All kidding aside, I think getting that kind of respect for an area that was sort of fringe and has now become core is absolutely superb.
One last question.
I thought we saw one more hand. It's always hard to get people to take. Oh, we've got several last questions. One way in the back and then one up front here. Keep your hand up in the back, and the mic is coming towards you. There you go. And then you're next in the front. So 2 last questions.
So historically, America's been known for having an economy based off of industrialization and an industrial economy, but now the backbone's more so focused on services. So how do you feel about the implications for that going forward as it relates to like job transitioning and social unemployment?
Look, so I think this issue of transition in the economy is really important. And it's not just sort of manufacturing to services, but I think one of the big things that's happening now is a move from, we call it industrial to post-industrial or industrial to information. I think it is, we had these huge transitions in the US economy, it seems like once every 100 years. The last one was from agrarian, rural agriculture to urban industrial. And now we're going from industrial to information, if you will. What do we know about these things? Whenever we have these big transitions, some things seem immutable. One is you do get, when that happens, you get these big dislocations of those who feel they're being left behind versus those who are in the lead, if you will, and are doing much better. And that has led to populism, and it happened again, it's happening now here in the US and other places. And so that tells us that we're going to have to figure out what I describe as a new paradigm of sustainable capitalism that brings everybody along, those without a college education as well as those like the folks in this room who are going to be incredibly well educated. We have to find new ways to create new jobs for everybody that gets people back into the middle class. When this happened with the agrarian society, we had the rise of unions and other things and progressivism under a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, whom some of you know if you're US citizens. So we need, well, know of, I don't know if you know him, but know of him. So I think we're going to need to sort of have some leaders that are sort of rethinking what the economic social compact is, similar to what Teddy Roosevelt did around progressivism. So that's sort of a philosophical answer to your question, but that's really sort of the way I've been thinking about it for some period of time. It's a good thing to have these transitions. We can't stay backward looking all the time, but we do know these transitions from one type of economy to the other are pretty rocky, and that's what we're going through right now. And I think sir, you have the last question.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Mr. Vice Chairman. I know you mentioned earlier about 9/11, and you were celebrated and credited for essentially saving the economy during the crisis. I just wanted to know if you could walk us through sort of the decisions you made and sort of what your experience was.
So I'll do it pretty briefly because it's the kind of thing that one could spend a long time on. So the first thing that happened on the day, and this goes back to, remember I talked about my wife that I met at a law firm. So on 9/11, my wife was responsible for regulating all the securities markets in the US. She was a senior staff person at the SEC. The SEC had something called the watch desk, which was watching markets and looking at CNN and other broadcasts every minute. So she called me after the first plane had gone to the first tower. No one had seen it, obviously, but the tower was on fire. And she said, Roger, you ought to turn on the TV. I'm not quite sure what's happening, but one of the Twin Towers is on fire. And so I was watching and saw the second plane go into the second tower. So the first decision I made was, contrary to what the president had ordered, was that I would not evacuate the Federal Reserve building. The reason I thought that was really important was I could see just by looking out in the streets that there was complete chaos in Washington with people trying to get away from buildings and all this. And in moments of chaos, something needs to be a fixed point that everyone else can interact with. And I decided, sort of instinctively, I'm making it sound like it was very analytical, and I thought it through this way. But I decided that I'd stay at the Federal Reserve building, and as long as the phones were working, I could be in touch with markets and be in touch with other governments, et cetera. So that was the first major decision, was the decision to not evacuate the building. I couldn't make everybody stay. I didn't try to lock the doors, but I'm really, to this day, quite humbled by the number of Fed staffers that stayed in Washington with me to try to make sure the system worked. The second big decision that I made, over the objection of some of the Federal Reserve governors, of Federal Reserve presidents, was to keep the entire system open and operating. And that's because the Federal Reserve works as a system. You need all nodes working. And so we had a call with me and all the presidents at around 10:30 or something like that. And some of them didn't want to, some of them wanted to close, and I said, no, we all have to stay open. And so that was, they all went along, obviously. We didn't take a formal vote, but that was the second big decision. Other decisions that we made were pretty technical. I won't bore you with them, but basically keeping the electronic payment system that the Fed is responsible for open 24 hours a day for the first couple of days. It normally closes at 11 or something like that. We decided to keep it open as long as need be. That's fairly technical, but what it meant was that the payment systems that allow big banks to transfer money would stay open. The fourth big decision I made was that we would clear all checks without knowing the balances in other banks. Again, this sounds sort of technical, but what that meant is that anybody who had written a check that day could be assured that their money would be in the account. And that's pretty important because I didn't want people to get into crisis mode. And then the fifth thing, and I'm ticking these things off relatively quickly, was to flood all the ATMs with money, particularly in the New York area and Washington and other places that were affected. And to the best of my knowledge, on that day, only one ATM ran out of money. And the reason that's really important is in a crisis moment, the first thing people do is they go and try to get some cash if the system works, and it did. And I didn't want to have ATMs running out of money because that would have created panic that we don't have enough cash, which was obviously not the case. So those are 4 or 5 of them. I sort of clicked them off here as though that's the way it occurred, but those are some of the major decisions. But the most important one was really just to stay open because all the president's advisors were scattering around, and that was true here in New York for obvious reasons. And eventually, almost anybody who had anything to do with markets or investing ended up calling my office. And so we, the Fed, became the complete spider in the web that kept the whole system working that day. And so I get some credit for it is actually a huge amount of teamwork on the part of the entire Federal Reserve System with literally thousands of folks who you'll never have the honor of meeting, but that's sort of the way it worked, and those are some of the 4 or 5 of the major decisions. Is that okay?
Sure. With that said, thank you, Roger, for joining us tonight.
Great. Thank you all very, very much. Thanks. So I'm going to do your pop quiz, and you'll see why this is important, or may not be important why I want to do it. Okay.
I see some graphs in there as well.
There's some graphs. So I'm going to read you 5 questions. You're going to get each one of these right, and then I'm going to tell you something about your generation of folks. So listen closely. The first one, suppose you had $100 in a savings account, and the interest rate was 2% per year. After 5 years, how much do you think you would have in the account if you left the money to grow? Start with $100, 2% interest every year for 5 years. Don't yell out. It's easy. Don't yell it out. So more than $102, exactly $102, or less than $102, or do not know. So the obvious answer is more than $102, right? This is pretty straightforward, not that complicated. Question 2. Imagine the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year, and inflation was 2% per year. So interest 1%, inflation 2%. After 1 year, how much would you be able to buy with the money in this account? More than today, exactly the same, less than today, or do not know? So the answer is less than today, because inflation is 2%, you're earning 1%, so the dollar, the currency has gone down in value, purchasing power. Question 3, please tell me whether this statement is true or false. Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. Is that true or false? True, false, do not know. A bunch of you saying false. Okay, so you've got it right. So let me tell you, in your generation, how many people got each one of these right. On the first question, 81% got it right. Okay, and 8% didn't know. On the second question, 59% got it right. So 40% did not understand how inflation works. On the third question, only half of the people got it right. And so the reason I'm saying this is I'm sure all of you got this, all these questions correct, right? Yes, yes, you did. This is a test about financial literacy, so I commend you because you're all very financially literate, but the big challenge for your generation is half the people who took this test don't know the basic answers around these 3 very, very simple questions. So I wanted to stop by giving you a pop quiz that make you all feel really good. So congratulations, and please enjoy your dinner. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.